We're going to get the camera rolling. Wonder if there's enough light for it. Before we get started with our Distinguished Speaker Series today, I want to acknowledge a couple people in the room. Sylvia Munoz-Schnapp is a current City Council member. Steve Stocks of the very long-term serving Oxnard Union High School District Board of Trustee member. And John Sharkey, a very long-term serving City Councilman with the Port of Hueneme. Of course, Larry Downing is the one who holds this all together. Becky helps a lot too. Becky Green, thank you very much.
And Beverly
Bob
Kelly,
citizen. Don't forget about Security Bob. He's in charge of all security matters. So if you need to give him some input or criticism,
and Beverly,
he's open for suggestions. And Beverly, our Citizen of the Year, current City of Port Hueneme. My name's Stephen Gama. I volunteer here at the port, at this museum, and want to remind you of a couple things coming up. We have port tours. The next one is April 19th, and we also have a lighthouse tour that is May 18th. So if you are interested in that, you can see Larry, and he'll help you get signed up for that. On April 27th, Wayne Day is going to be here speaking the day the Vikings arrived in America. May 4th, Dennis O'Leary will also be here for the history of Cinco de Mayo. Also on May 4th, we have the Port Hueneme Youth Involvement Fair at the Orvine Carpenter Community Center. So if you have grandchildren, neighbors, any young kid that's looking to get involved in something wholesome, send them down. It's going to be from 12 to 3. It's going to be free lunch and $2,500 in gifts that we're going to give away to the youth that come and participate. So it's kind of like a youth, it's kind of like a job fair, but it's a youth fair where we have vendors that provide youth services such as junior lifeguard, police explorers, sea cadets, a whole bunch of other stuff. So again, that's on May 4th at the Orvine Carpenter Center. Also, coming up on May 27th, the third annual Memorial Day celebration here at City Hall at 8:30 a.m. It's our third annual. Larry's works very hard to bring us together. We have a great list of dignitaries coming this year. Julia Brownlee will be here, right?
Yes.
And if you haven't been to it, please come. It's a very well-attended, really, really good to participate in that. And we have a lot of participation from youth groups, junior ROTC, the Sea Cadets, and they help. They volunteer out there to pull the whole program together. Okay, did I miss anything? Oh, on Cinco de Mayo at the VFW, we're cooking. We're doing a fundraiser for the VFW, crispy tacos, rice and beans, and salsa.
And Steve, Sylvia's going to be speaking at the Council Library annual meeting. She's going to be doing her Cristero Rebellion one from 2 to 4 at the library.
And that's on July 6th.
No, that's on Cinco de Mayo.
That's on Cinco de Mayo?
Yeah.
Okay, it's not here on my list.
No, it's for the Friends of the Library.
Okay, so there's a lot going on in Cinco de Mayo. You go lecture, come have lunch with us.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so today we are very honored to have John Krist. He was a senior writer with the Ventura County Star for 25 years, I believe. Currently, he is the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer for the Ventura County Farm Bureau. But today, he's going to talk to us about an assignment. We were talking earlier, and I think he asked for the assignment. It wasn't necessarily given to him, but it was a pretty cool assignment to trace the tracks of the Lewis and Clarke expedition. He wrote a book about that, and if you've ever been up into the Pacific Northwest,
There's another one over there.
you know that that's where it ended, and there's a county named after Clarke there, and there's a lot of stuff named after him. So I'm kind of interested as to what happened over there in the Pacific Northwest, because I've been up there a lot. It's amazing how much Lewis and Clarke have influenced that area. So without any further ado, I'd like to present to you author and journalist John Krist.
Thanks very much, Steve. Can y'all? I think I'll just hold it. right, well, good morning. Wow, nice, good-sized crowd. If we had any more people, we'd have to go outside, I think. So as Steve said, my name's John Krist. I am the CEO of the Farm Bureau. But yeah, for nearly 25 years, I was a reporter, columnist, editor at the Ventura County Star. And I want to thank Larry and Beverly for inviting me to give this talk, because it allowed me to revisit a part of my life that was basically occurred 20 years ago. And it was a lot of fun. This was a project that I actually proposed to the editor of the paper at the time, Tim Gallagher. Back, I think it was in late 2000. I knew the bicentennial of the Lewis and Clarke expedition was coming up in 2003, and I thought it would be a great idea to retrace their route and write a series of stories for the paper about what it was like for them 200 years before, what it's like today on the trail, and how the landscape in between along the trail has changed. And so I did a series of stories that appeared throughout 2002, and then leading up to the bicentennial, and then a few more in 2003, and I turned that series into a book. I'm not sure which of us was more astonished when Tim said yes to this project, him or me. But I'm really eternally grateful to Tim for greenlighting the project, because it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. I spent 3 months on the trail. I hiked, walked, kayaked, biked more than about 16,000 miles through 23 states while working on this program. And I had really the adventure of a lifetime. It was kind of a life-changing experience for me. So what I'm going to do today is sort of take you along that journey and talk about what Lewis and Clarke experienced, a little bit about what I experienced. This expedition was the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson, and Beverly reminds me today's TJ's birthday, so that's awesome. This is his home, Monticello. This is the interior up here. It's a recreation of what he called his Indian Hall. It's where many of the artifacts that Lewis and Clarke brought back on the journey were displayed there. Unfortunately, they're all basically lost to history. But Jefferson's reason for commissioning this expedition was that he had just bought some land. When Jefferson became president in 1800, 2/3 of the nation's population lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. We were just a tiny country, coastal in nature. In 1802, he sent ministers to France, to Napoleon Bonaparte, proposing to buy the port of New Orleans, because they thought that it was not very good having a foreign country in charge of one of the most important ports for the United States. Instead of selling them the port of New Orleans, he offered to sell them the entire Louisiana territory, 820,000 square miles, for $15 million, which works out to 3 cents an acre. And overnight, as you can see here, it doubled the size of the United States. So the problem is nobody really knew what he'd just bought. So this is the best map available at the time. This is by an Englishman named Aaron Arrowsmith. And Jefferson had purchased a copy of this in 1803. So you can see it's pretty detailed about the East Coast. It's very detailed up in the Pacific Northwest, where traders have been visiting for a long time. And it's even pretty detailed up here. But this is a big blank. This mic doesn't like me very much. So this is, I'm going to just talk. Okay? Can you all hear me?
The video. That's you.
Yeah, well.
Can you put it on?
No, it's cutting in and out is the problem. Yeah, well, we'll see. Okay. So the existence of the Rockies was known because traders had come out of Canada up into the very northern part, but this is all speculative. And there was this assumption at the time that the West was sort of a mirror image of the East, and that the Rockies were a relatively low range of mountains, sort of like the Blue Ridge. And so what Jefferson was really interested in is not only understanding what was out there, but trying to see if there was a way, and this is what they fervently believed, to get across the continent by water. So his theory was you sail up the Missouri to its headwaters, you walk across the mountain range, probably take a day or so, and you plop yourself down in the headwaters of the Columbia, and you ride that to the ocean. So this is what, if they could do that, it would open up this immense trade possibilities with Asia and obviate the need for going all the way around the Horn to get over to the ocean. So, to Europe. So he appointed his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to head up this expedition of exploration. Lewis was 29 years old when this began. He was an Army veteran, had served for 2 years as Jefferson's secretary, and was at home in the wilderness. He'd grown up not very far from Jefferson in the same Virginia countryside, spent a lot of time outdoors. And this is Meriwether. And his co-commander, William Clarke, was 4 years older than Lewis, also a Virginian and an Army veteran. Again, like a hardy outdoorsman. And they were an interesting team. Meriwether Lewis was, let's say, enthusiastic and energetic and creative. And Clarke was the solid, can't ruffle his feathers guy who was well respected by his men. And this is what they were told to do. So the object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as by its course and communication with the water of the Pacific Ocean may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent. He also assigned them to do a lot of other things. He wanted them to collect information about the plants, the native people, the animals, the geology. Keep an eye out for timber resources, mineral resources, farmland. He really wanted to know what was out there and what the prospects were for settlement, because Jefferson had it in his head that this was the destiny of the country, was to expand into this new western territory that he purchased. And he was kind of hoping that Lewis and Clarke would basically be producing a guidebook for the eventual settlement of this territory. So this is their route. This is St. Louis, Missouri, Fort Clatsop in Oregon, and this is the route I followed. So I know the type is pretty small, but they set out on August 31st, 1803 from Pittsburgh. They had ordered some boats to be constructed, and they picked them up in Pittsburgh. They had recruited some men already. They recruited more there. They took the vessels down the Ohio River to the Mississippi, and they first wintered there across from the mouth of the Missouri River on a site that is no longer there. It's actually been swallowed by the river. They left in May of 1804 from there and headed up the Missouri. They wintered in North Dakota at a series of villages up there, and then left in, April of 1805 and headed for the coast. And then they returned in 1806 to St. Louis. That makes it sound easy. It wasn't. So this is Gateway Arch in St. Louis. It's the official start of the trail. There's a park there called the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. And there's a fantastic museum underneath the arch there that has all these fantastic displays about the Lewis and Clarke Trail and the landscape. And that's one of the first places I went, and looking at those pictures was really exciting because it let me know what I was going to be seeing over the next few months. So this is their flotilla. So they had 3 boats. 2 of them were these smaller boats called pirogues, and then there was the one big keel boat, which was 55 feet long and 8 feet wide, and you could carry 10 tons of supplies while drawing only 3 feet of water. It was perfectly suited for navigation on shallow rivers. The 2 smaller ones are about 30 feet long. These are replicas that are moored on a lake in Lewis and Clarke State Park near Ottawa, Iowa, of all places. The gentleman there adjusting things was the boat builder, and it was a lot of fun. I got to visit them and hang out on the boats. We we rode the pirogue around a little bit, and I got to sleep overnight in the cabin of the keelboat, which was way cool. These could all be sailed, they could be rowed, they could be poled, or they could be dragged. And in fact, drag is mostly what they did at the beginning. Because Missouri's a shallow, fickle, weird, sandbar-laden river. And so it was very difficult to row upstream. They left early in the season. The flow was really heavy. And it was very difficult to pole because of the unstable banks. This is the river. There's cows in it. It's so shallow. They're walking around out there on a sandbar. So really what they ended up having to do is they would tie a rope basically to the front, and they would walk along the shore and drag this boat upstream against the current, which was about as much fun as it sounds, quoted by their journals. So this is, let's see, Fort Atkinson State Historic Park. It was the first formal meeting they had with Native Americans on the journey. This is Gavin's Point Dam down here, one of 6 huge dams that have been built on the Upper Missouri to regulate its flow now. It's not really as difficult to navigate as it was in Lewis and Clarke's day. And this is interesting. This is the largest, most prominent monument anywhere along the Lewis and Clarke Trail. It's a 100-foot sandstone obelisk, and it's on the gravesite of Sergeant Charles Floyd. He was the only expedition member to die on the entire journey. And he died about 3 months after they left, probably of appendicitis. So even if he'd stayed home, he'd been dead. Yeah. So, and that's a really impressive stat. Bad for Sergeant Floyd, but the fact that only one guy died on the entire expedition still amazes me. So as they continued up, they made their way finally onto the Great Plains in South Dakota. And imagine for a minute what it was like for them to find themselves in the Great Plains. They had grown up in the woods of Virginia. They had never seen as far as they are seeing now out there. The horizon was never that far away. It's dry. The vegetation is completely different than anything they had ever seen before, and so are the animals. These are plains bison. They encountered them on August 23rd, 1804, near what is now Vermilion, South Dakota. And this was to them amazing, the abundance of wild game on the plains. They were big meat eaters. They were eating like 6 or 7 pounds of meat a day per person because they were burning the calories, dragging these boats. But there were animals everywhere. At the time that they were going up the river, biologists estimate there were 25 million bison, at least, roaming the plains. And of course, and there, some estimates are that it was as high as 70 million. They record in their journals stopping, and for an entire day, a herd's going by, crossing the river. They're waiting for it to pass so they can continue on. Of course, by the arrival of the 20th century, there are only about 2 dozen left in Yellowstone National Park. So one way that things have changed out there. There are still some national parks and state parks out there where there are free-roaming herds. It's pretty cool. It's not the black-tailed prairie dog, another crazily abundant animal. There were probably about 5 billion of them out there on the plains at the time. There was one prairie. They live in they call them towns, communities. Basically, a large area, lots of shared burrows, and there's animals everywhere. There was one prairie dog town in Texas that was surveyed around 1900. It was 100 miles by 250 miles. And probably contained 400 million animals. So basically it was a rodent metropolis the size of West Virginia. And Lewis and Clarke were just like innately fascinated by these critters. And they make a lot of noise. There's always sentries standing up, and they squeal when they see danger, and they run around and they all head for their burrows when they get scared. They decided it'd be cool to catch one. So for like a day, the men of the expedition are running around with buckets, pouring water in holes and plugging them up, trying to chase a prairie dog out that they can catch. Eventually, they flush one poor bedraggled prairie dog from his hole, and they cage him up, and they actually sent him all the way back to Thomas Jefferson at his home. Yes, along with some magpies. It actually survived for a while. Just imagine, you're the guy at the White House, on the staff of Thomas Jefferson, and somebody comes and knocks on the door and delivers a small weird animal in a cage, and I'm sure Jefferson thought it was great. So, it's important to remember they weren't traveling across an uninhabited wilderness. It was fully inhabited already. And so they were the first representatives of the United States to make contact with 11 of the 14 tribes living along the course of the upper Missouri. And for the most part, these interactions went surprisingly well. But again, they did not fare well in the aftermath of the expedition either. I'll talk about the one exception to their generally peaceable interactions with the natives later. This is Badlands National Park. There's still a few places you can go out there on the plains where it looks just like it did in their day. This is one of them. There's also Custer State Park is pretty cool too. But it's increasingly difficult to find sort of a non-agricultural example of the landscape out there.
They're in the boat here, right?
Yeah.
Not walking.
No, they were in a boat most of the way. So this is a replica of Fort Mandan. So this is where they spent their first winter on the trail. It's in North Dakota near Washburn. For reasons of authenticity, I guess, I accompanied a group that went out and stayed there for several nights. We slept outdoors. It was 0 degrees and snowy. Slept is not really the right word for it. It's like sleeping in a bag on the snow in the January in North Dakota. I don't think I slept at all, actually. So this is where they settled. They had already traveled 1,600 miles, but winter was coming. Sorry, Game of Thrones fans? No. Anyway, so they weren't going to make it all the way to the coast. So they decided to hunker down here. There was a series of villages in this area, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. They call the three tribes. They had banded together and were living in a complex of villages here. It was really an interesting area. These combined villages had a population of about 5,000, which was bigger than Washington, D.C. at the time. And it was at the center of this continent-wide trading network. The tribes themselves were sedentary farmers. They raised corn, squash, beans, sunflowers. But they had found trading goods all the way from Central America, as well as from the Pacific coast and the Great Plains up there. So trappers had already made their way up this far, so this was still known territory relatively. But when they leave here, they're going to be entering unknown territory. They're going to be going to places nobody had ever been before. The Mandan weren't stupid like we were, sleeping out in the snow. They built these earth lodges. It's basically a framework of wood. It's like an overturned basket covered with a thick layer of earth, and it's very well insulated. And we did get to go inside and have dinner on the one night. You build a fire in there, and we were peeling off our layers. It's pretty warm. So while they were wintering there with the Mandan and the Hidatsa, they met a pregnant 16-year-old girl named Sacagawea. And she ended up being one of the most famous women in American history. She was a Shoshone by birth, a native of the mountain prairies of eastern Idaho, and she'd been taken captive in western Montana by a Hidatsa raiding party when she was 10 or 11. And they brought her hundreds of miles across the plains to this complex of villages. And she was living there, married to a 45-year-old French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau. And Lewis and Clarke hired the two of them to be interpreters because they figured when they got to the end of the Missouri and they were going to walk across that low range of hills on their way to the headwaters of Columbia, they would need horses to carry their stuff. They didn't want to carry it themselves. And so they knew the Shoshone there would be the horse people that they would need to borrow or buy horses from. So they wanted Sacagawea along with them because she could speak to them. So she gave, this is probably the most amazing thing about the entire expedition. She gave birth during the winter and brought the baby with her. So they're finishing their journey with a teenage mom and her baby, which was, the guys were hardcore. That's really hardcore. So at this point, they sent the keelboat back with a whole bunch of stuff that they'd collected already because they knew the river would be getting smaller as they were heading up and that boat would no longer be useful. And they made a bunch of dugout canoes like this to carry their stuff, carry them. They sent some of the contingent, some of the soldiers went back with that stuff, plant specimens, bones, antlers, all kinds of good stuff, including that prairie dog and a live magpie. Actually, they sent several, but the magpie and the prairie dog made it all the way back. So this was quite a journey. They went down the Missouri and the Mississippi to New Orleans, then went by sea around Florida, up the East Coast to Chesapeake Bay, and then overland by wagon from Baltimore to Washington, where they were delivered to the lighthouse.
Wow.
So that's quite a trek.
What's the magpie?
A bird. Magpie, yeah, it's real. We have, yeah, they're quite I mean, they have really long tails and they're really loud. And yeah, they'll steal anything that's shiny that's not nailed down. So this is the Upper Missouri. So this is, now they're taking off. It's spring of the following year. And this is a really cool place. There's a 149-mile stretch of the Upper Missouri. It's a wild and scenic river, and it looks just like it did when they did it. And you can canoe it, which is what I did. Took my family and we camped, and it's really cool because if you're carrying a copy of their journals, as I was, you can read descriptions of the camps where they stayed. They were meticulous in recording their experiences. And you can, sit there and look around, and it's like this is the place they're describing. We are literally camped at the same spot, and it's pretty wild. The roads reached that river only 3 times during that entire 149-mile stretch.
So were you there at the same time they were?
roughly the same time of year, roughly. Yeah. So I broke my trip into 2 pieces. I did. In early summer, I did the stretch from St. Louis up to this area, so it was summer by then. And then I stopped, went home, and then I came back in the fall to make the rest of the trip. So I'd be hitting the coast and the Rockies roughly at the same time that they did. So Lewis was fancied himself as quite the creative writer. Their spelling is atrocious. They spelled phonetically, which is pretty common at the time, but it makes reading the journals quite an adventure. But this is his description of the section of the Upper Missouri, which he, I love that phrase, seems a visionary enchantment. So he was quite captivated by the terrain, and I gotta say, it was quite enchanting. This was a sunset camp one night. So beyond there, the river does some interesting things. This is not far from where the previous photo was taken. This is the Great Falls of the Missouri, which is where the town of Great Falls gets its name. So the entire Missouri River, it's over 1,000 feet wide at this point, plunged over basically a cliff, a 90-foot cliff. And you could, according to them, you could hear it and see it from miles away, the spray going up in the air. They said they could hear it from 5 miles away. But it's interesting, you read his journal, Lewis's journal, and he works at trying to describe what he's seeing, sitting there looking at this amazing sight. And it goes on for several pages, and he's just like grappling with it, trying to come up with something, and finally you could just sense him like throwing down his pencil. He says, "I am much disgusted by my imperfect description of this scene." So to get around this, obviously you couldn't sail a boat over this thing. It took them over a week to portage around it. They had to get off the river, drag everything, all this really, really heavy gear and equipment. And of course, that's what it looks like today, because where they saw, amazing things, grandeur, our more recent relatives saw kilowatts, and so there was a series of dams built there. And it either completely drowned it or diverted the river completely around it. So you can't see those things anymore. So as I continued up the Missouri, it got smaller and smaller until finally near the town of Three Forks, Montana. The Missouri basically stops and 3 tributaries take off. That's where the Missouri begins. And so they named them after Jefferson. One is named the Jefferson, one is named the Madison, and the other is named the Gallatin after the Treasury Secretary and Secretary of State. And they had to decide which one they thought was the real one, the big one that was going to take them the farthest. And so they chose the Jefferson. and they were correct. But the river gets really small there. It's basically a blue water trout stream at this point. So they're dragging their boats over rocks and stuff. And the Jefferson finally comes to an end. They're starting to climb up into the mountains. And then they ascend another tributary. And eventually the creek has gotten so small they really can't proceed anymore. So they stop and they start walking. And they're heading up in the hills. And eventually they literally come to a spring where the water bubbles out of the ground and forms the creek that then becomes the tributary of the Jefferson, which then becomes the Missouri. So they take turns like standing with one foot on each side and saying, "Look at me, I'm standing with one foot on each side of the Missouri." So this is for them a really exciting moment because
Is that still there?
yeah, that is.
You went
Yeah,
there?
yeah. You can actually drive to it on a dirt road. It's pretty cool. There's a little campsite nearby.
Did you stand with one foot?
I did. Just so I can come up and say I did. But this is a really exciting moment for them, right? They've been traveling all this time. They've reached the headwaters of the Missouri. They're in the mountains. They think if they walk up to the pass that they can see from this spot, they're going to get to the top and look over, and they're going to maybe not be able to see the ocean, but they'll be able to see the river, meaning that they're going to be following to the ocean. So, this is pretty exciting for them. So, that's what they do. They walk up there, and they get to the top, and they look out, and they don't see the ocean. They don't see the Columbia. They see the Rockies. And at this moment, they realize there is no water route across North America. And this dream that people had for so many years just kind of dies at this moment, and they realize not only is this going to be a little walk, it's going to be an arduous journey. And indeed, this takes them a very long time. They get here fairly late in the year. It's getting cold, and now they're up in the Rockies. They have to cross on foot. They're trying to find horses, and they eventually do. Sacagawea is able to hook them up with the Shoshone. Amazingly, it turns out that the person that they're negotiating with is her brother, who she hadn't seen since she was kidnapped. So what are the odds you can't make this stuff up? So they get horses and they set off to cross the Rockies. It's late fall. It starts snowing. It's winter is there just about. So the game has all gone to lower elevation, so there's nothing to eat. It's really rugged countryside up there. There's a very terrible dirt road that goes along the spine of the mountains there in Idaho that I drove along until I finally got scared I was going to get stuck up there because it was actually snowing when I was doing it. And it was so rugged that the horses were falling off the trail, and their gear was getting demolished. Lewis's riding desk was one of the early casualties. So they're hungry. This takes them almost 2 weeks. They're starving. They're weak. They're cold. They're miserable. Their generals say this is the most miserable any of them had ever been. And these are guys who basically have been through wars. So they eventually make it, and this is late September. They basically stumble out of the mountains onto the banks of the Clearwater River in Idaho, and they meet the Nez Perce tribe who are there. And this is a really amazing moment as well on the journey, because here are a bunch of half-starved, sick, weak, emaciated explorers with guns, ammunition, iron kettles, just amazing riches. And the Nez Perce could have, without even thinking about it, wiped them out and taken that stuff. Instead, they feed them, and they allow them to stay with them to recover from their ordeal. They give them horses to help replace the ones that they lost. They had gotten to the point where not only were they losing horses that were rolling down the hill, they were killing them and eating them to avoid starving. So they do recover, and they make some more canoes, and they start down the Clearwater. Clearwater leads to the Snake, which again was a whitewater river at the time. They were running rapids. It's completely dammed and turned into a series of basically lakes for barge traffic. So then you can't see that. But they were running rapids in hollowed out tree trunks. I mean, I've traveled a lot of whitewater rivers on rafts and canoes, kayaks, but never in a tree trunk. They did a lot of crashing into things and overturning and losing more stuff, and sometimes they would just have to portage around. Then the snake reaches the Columbia eventually. So they follow the Columbia. This is the Columbia Gorge. It's a really amazing place. The Cascade Range rose up in the path of the river, and the river simply cut through it and kept going. So the Columbia Gorge is quite a deep, spectacular thing. Again, the river was very different when they were on it. There were waterfalls and rapids. Again, it's been dammed and turned into a sequence of lakes essentially. But it's where two very different geographic and ecological provinces meet. So you've got the semi-arid plateau of the interior and the lush rainforest essentially of the Pacific coast like meet in this place. It's a really dynamic environment.
So the snake, that's on the other side of the Continental Divide?
No, the snake. So once they were at the top, they got into
They're
clear
still on
water,
the other side.
heading west, and then to the snake, then to the Columbia.
The Columbia's on the other side.
It's on the west side.
Yeah.
Yeah, the snake's not.
Yeah, and the snake and
Oh,
the
they're
deer.
both on?
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So once they walked away from that spring and went over the top, everything, all the water that falls is going west.
Okay, so they're on land for quite a ways?
Yeah.
How long were you on land?
It was a couple of weeks that they were trying to cross the Rockies. Yeah. And really killed them. So that's Celilo Falls. This is one of the things they had, the obstacles they had to get around on the Columbia River. This is a very densely populated gorge, and that's because what they're doing there is fishing for salmon with really long dip nets. What's that?
You wait for them to jump or swim by?
Yeah, they would just scoop them out of the pool. So the salmon are going upstream to spawn at this point, and they're going to make it over that waterfall somehow. But while they're getting ready for the attempt, they're congregating in the pools there at the base. And so these guys would these really long dip nets with like 10-foot long handles, and they would scoop these salmon out of the river. Imagine,
Is that a painting of it?
no, that's a photograph actually.
Oh, so they do it now?
No, this doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, it's awful.
It got drowned, yeah. So there's this 40-foot cataract, and the Yakima, Wanapum, Walla Walla, Wishim, and Uinta Indians would come here and basically harvest this amazing bounty.
This is in Idaho?
This is so it's Washington and Oregon. Columbia is the border between the two states. I'm not sure which side we're on, so I guess we're on the Oregon side here. But that waterfall was drowned in 1957 by the Dalles Dam, so it's not there anymore. So they continued down the Columbia, and on November 7th, 1805, they reached the estuary. This is approximately where William Clarke writes in his journal, "Ocean in view, oh the joy." You can't see the ocean from there. They're still 20 miles from the ocean, but the river is so broad at this point that you can't tell that it's not the ocean. So things get really miserable at this point because the weather's turning. It's basically winter by now. November. It's raining. The waves, they're trying to paddle out there in storms. The waves are soaking them and overturning them. And it took them basically 10 days to do that 20 miles from where they thought they saw the ocean to actually getting to the coast. But on November 24th, they were deciding, the two sides of the river were very different. One was flatter, probably better for camp, but didn't appear to be as much game. The other was wetter, more forested, but there were elk, so they'd be able to harvest. So they're trying to decide where to set up camp. And remarkably, they put it to a vote of the entire party. And everybody gets to vote, including Sacagawea and Clarke's slave, York. So this is quite a long time before women and blacks got the right to vote in the United States, but they had everybody cast a vote. So they decided to set up camp on the south side, on the Oregon side. And so they built Fort Clatsop, which sort of looks a bit like Fort Mandan, same basic structure. This is a replica that it's really funny. I got to go there, and that was really cool and everything. About a year after I was there, it burned down. So it's since been rebuilt, so you can go visit it now.
What city is that?
It's near Astoria, Oregon. Yeah. So, this is just kind of a guess about what it looked like. There aren't any, pictures or drawings of it in the journals. But they spent 4 months here in the winter time. And during those 4 months, it rained on all but 12 days. So it was a pretty soggy winter. And they only saw the sun 6 of those days. So it was gloomy, it was wet. They spent the time working on their journals, updating the maps, making clothing. One of the expedition members, Patrick Gass, had his own journal, and he records that they made precisely 338 pairs of moccasins from Clarke. Because they were practically barefoot by this time. But by the end of the winter, they are nuts. They are going stir crazy. They're in lousy spirits. They're grumpy, which is really interesting. And this was a Far Side cartoon that appeared on while I was working on the project, which I thought was pretty funny. Yeah, that's Clarke. God, I hate it. Yeah. So they were so eager to get out that they left on March 23rd, 1806, a long time before they should have. For a while, they traveled up the river by water, but eventually they just abandoned the canoes, bought horses so they could make better time. By May, they had made it back to the mountains, to the Bitterroot Mountains, the Rockies, and then they had to stop because the entire range was buried in snow. There was no way to get across at that point. They left a little bit too early. So they hung out with the Nez Perce again for about a month, waiting for the snow to melt, and then they took off. They made it across, and when they got on the other side, they split up. So this is one of the most questionable decisions that they made on the entire journey. They're already really small. They're in an area where they don't know all the tribes very well, and there are some that are known to be hostile to white folks.
Did you know how many people there were then?
There were. I don't remember off the top of my head. We're talking less than 2 dozen. It's like 20 or so. Yeah. So this is June. They reached the Yellowstone River, where it comes in to Missouri. And so they split the parties up, and Clarke took most of the men and explored the Yellowstone to see what that country looked like. And then Lewis took a smaller group, just a handful of people, and headed up another tributary, the Marias River. And his reason for doing that is there was some speculation that it might actually extend up into Canada. And if it did, it's a tributary of the Missouri, which the United States owns, it would give them claim all the way into Canada. So that was a strategic objective that Thomas Jefferson had asked them to explore. So Clarke's group pauses at this really prominent outcrop, sandstone butte. He named it Pompey's Tower after their nickname for Jean-Baptiste, the child of Sacagawea. And this is really interesting because on the entire 8,000-mile trail, this is the only place where you actually see physical evidence of them passing. William Clarke carved his name in the sandstone there, which is really kind of cool. It's the only tangible evidence that they left.
And it's still there?
It's still there. It's
Really?
protected under glass. You climb up on the boardwalk and you can see it. So it's pretty good. So Lewis and he took 3 men, so he and his 3 men are traveling north. They get almost to Canada, but it doesn't go to Canada. But where they stop, they encounter 3 members of the Blackfeet tribe, which is one of the most powerful and feared tribes on the northern plains. They shared a meal together and camped near each other. They were a little uneasy. Lewis makes his typical speech upon meeting the natives. It's like, we're opening this territory up to trade. We're going to bring goods and be bringing wealth to your area. But to the being Blackfeet, this is not good news. What they're hearing is, we're going to come here and arm your enemies. So they were a little, this is an example of Lewis really not understanding his audience very well. So the next morning they wake up and a fight breaks out. Some of the Blackfeet are trying to steal guns and make off with them. And a melee breaks out, and the members of the expedition stab one of the Indians to death and shoot another to death. And then they take off because they're afraid. There's like 4 of them, and they're in hostile territory. So they took off and ran as fast as they could, reunited with Clarke's group, and they all made it back. So this was the only overtly hostile encounter between the expedition and any of the native tribes that they encountered. And it's, you can see the list. There were quite a few native tribes that they encountered. And it's kind of inexplicable why this happened, but like I said, they were in a bad mood when they left.
So is that all in the journal? That's how we know about it?
Yeah, this is all in their journals. So this is one of the cool things from as a journalist. I mean, they were literally the first journalists to explore the West. Right? They're writing down everything.
There were only 3 of them, right?
Well, this
They
was
didn't have 20 guys.
once they got all back together.
Yeah, they did when they were attacked.
Right, it was just
There
four
were just
of them.
Oh, 4 of them.
Yeah, Lewis and 3 men.
Huh.
So they continue on back down in Missouri, and they reach the Mandan villages in late August. And there they leave Sacagawea to son Charbonneau and your son Jean-Baptiste there. And then they move on. And they reach St. Louis on September 23rd, having been gone for 28 months, covered nearly 8,000 miles. And this is the detailed map that will be produced after. So this is the Rockies. This is what the Rockies look like. Not that little thin line, that we saw on that map at the very beginning. This is a really remarkable piece of cartography when you look at the distance, which they were calculating basically just by dead reckoning, how far they thought they had traveled. They missed the real length of this by only like something like 10 miles. They were really, really accurate at what they did. But
Were they
this,
surveyors? They weren't surveyors.
they weren't surveyors, although they trained.
I see.
When they were getting ready.
Military training.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, when I was in Washington, it was amazing how much impact they have in the Columbia Gorge area. So I was wondering, was that a result of them relying on the Indians? I mean, it seems like they really bonded out there because they were mentioned on every street corner.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically the present laying claim to the past. It's like
Really?
they're sort of these outside figures. They didn't spend much time. I mean, they spent 4 months holed up in the rain in Fort Clatsop, but they were just passing through it. But it was really interesting though. As they're going down the Columbia, I mean, they're in the middle of one of the greatest natural bounties of all time. There's 16 million salmon are coming each year up the river. At first they trade with the natives to get salmon, but all the men get sick. And whether or not it was something about the food didn't agree with their diets, or whether it was food poisoning, but they end up going down the greatest salmon run on the planet, and they're buying dogs from the Indians and eating dogs because they like that a lot better than the salmon.
Oh, wow. I heard that they were like trying to somebody in the ship trying to meet up with them.
Well, they were hoping that they would while they were on the Oregon coast, that they would be able to hook up with a trailer ship so that they could send stuff back. Because remember, since they sent the keel boat back after that first winter in Fort Mandan, nobody in the United States has heard from them. They've been gone for almost 2 years, and there's not been a word. Nobody even knows that they're alive. But of course they are, and when they make it back to St. Louis, they're greeted like conquering heroes. Sit down with the governor and all that good stuff. So what happens afterwards is like, in some ways a lot less exciting and fun and wonderful than the journey itself. Jefferson rewards them with a variety of things, but one of the things is he appoints Lewis governor of the Louisiana Territory. And this is something he's really ill-suited to do. His real job right now should be, they've got to prepare those journals for publication so the world will know what they found. This is his main job. but he gets basically consumed with petty political squabbling. He's trying to get the government to honor pledges he made to members of the expedition and other people they encountered, and to pay bills that he had incurred. And Congress is not really having any of that, so he's having a great deal of difficulty with this. And you know, the president is like starting to bug him. Where are the journals? Where are the journals? I want to read what you saw. So at one point he finally sets off from St. Louis and he heads to Washington to straighten out this mess with the government, with federal government, Congress. This is 1809 now, so 2 years after they returned. So he travels up the Missouri, the Mississippi, and then takes this road, you can call it that, called the Natchez Trace, which leads from the Tennessee to the Cumberland River. And he checks in at this roadside hostel, basically. It's like a little, it's called Grinder's Stand. It's a place where people who live there would rent rooms to travelers on the trace. So he checks in there on the evening of October 10th. The innkeeper offers him a bed, and he says, no, I'm just going to sleep on the floor at night, bearskin and buffalo robes. And then sometime during the night, a shot is fired, and he's killed. He's dead. And the conclusion at the time was he committed suicide. And it's interesting because neither Clarke nor Jefferson seemed surprised by that. They knew Lewis as a person who was prone to depression. He had been drinking heavily since he'd gotten back. And they were not surprised at all. They said, we always kind of worried that something like this might happen. There's been a lot of scholarship done since then. A book that came out about 2 years ago called Bitterroot, which really goes into a lot more detail and looks at a lot of different kinds of evidence. The truth is we'll never know what happened there, but there's an alternative school of thought that it wasn't suicide, that he was actually killed either by robbers or by somebody hired, by somebody he was involved in a feud with, but it's really unclear. But this is where he's buried, in this clearing along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee, and at the top of that monument, this pillar, it's broken off at the top. It's a symbol of a life that was cut short. Clarke has a very different kind of life afterwards. He lived a long and full life, and his final resting place is in Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis, and this is his grave marker. And buried nearby is his oldest son, who he named Meriwether Lewis Clarke, a tribute to his old friend. And this bust of Clarke, it's really kind of a haunting thing. It's sitting there in the cemetery, and it faces the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And nearby is an inscription that basically, in my way, is as succinct a way of describing everything that happened in the West in the century after Lewis and Clarke went through there. It's a quote from Deuteronomy: "Behold, the Lord thy God hath set the land before thee, go up and possess it." And that's pretty much what we did. So that's the end of my talk.
So they never had any inkling to go back? They never had idea to quit?
No. And what's interesting is, so when they got back to the Mandan villages, they, Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and their son, they stayed. A couple of the men also stayed, John Coulter being one of them, because they wanted to try their hand at trapping in this new area that they found. And some of them had really remarkable lives afterwards. And as I said, a couple of the men also had their own journals, but the rest just vanished from history. And so many of the artifacts that they brought back, they just, like when they got back to St. Louis, they were selling their guns, they were trading stuff for, whatever. And so they didn't place a premium on hanging on to any of that stuff. A lot of the stuff that they sent back to Jefferson, he displayed in his hall, but eventually a lot of it ended up in the hands of a gentleman named, I forget his first name, but Peel, in a museum. They were displayed at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And then a bunch of that ended up going to a museum that P.T. Barnum had in New York City. The museum burned down in the Civil War draft riots, and everything was lost. So there's basically nothing tangible, with the exception of a very few things. Like in the Smithsonian, there's like one of their compasses. And Harvard Peabody Museum has a few things as well. But it's, the cool thing though is that the stuff that did survive are the original journals. So there's the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. I actually got to hold one of them and read it in the original. And then the plant specimens that they collected. They pressed dried all kinds of plants that they found. The plant collection also made its way to the Museum of Natural History in Philadelphia, and a couple of others. So I was able to really get some of those too. It's really wild. He's looking at this piece of paper, a plant that was collected in the Rockies, and it's very Lewis was writing on the bottom describing where it was collected and on what date. It's way cool.
Questions? So it's kind of neat. We have a book for you, and it's a journey in and of itself. It's called A Troubled Dream, and it's a story of Richard Bard.
Oh, okay.
And what it took to create this port of Hueneme here. So when you read this book, it's really interesting because you get to the point where you're like, all right, you're finally going to do it. No. You got a few chapters to go. Also, we have a certificate of you, but we discovered a little bit of a
No, wait.
typographical type.
I seem to have misplaced it.
We'll get that.
Okay.
It does look like this.
You know where to find it. Awesome.
Right, so when you finish the book, we'll give you a certificate.
Okay. I do have a couple of copies of the book. Beverly's already bought one, but it's $20 if you want to buy one. Happily sign them for you.
Yep.
But yeah.
You're gonna pass the hat.
Yeah.
You're mentioning some of the place names that were given to Lewis and Clarke, geological places, but there's some of the botany, some of the, like the elegant Clarke.
Yeah, yeah. Clarke,
And that was very
Lewisia, which is, it's called Bitterroot, it's a state flower in Montana. Yeah.
Had you read the Stephen Ambrose book before?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I read, so the first Lewis and Clarke, the first popular historical book about the Lewis and Clarke expedition was actually written by David Lavender, who was an author and historian in Ojai. And I got to interview him as part of this project. Stephen Ambrose's book came out later and sold way more copies. And David was like, yeah, I wrote this first, and I think it's better, but I guess I can't be too grumpy about it. But I had those. I read basically every book that had been published about it.
Did you go back and forth or just one way?
Just one way. So I went, when I first drove out of here, the first place I went to was Tennessee, and I went to his grave. Just kind of I'm not sure why I did it that way, but it worked out better from a logistic standpoint, but actually it was kind of fitting to know how it ended the entire way. Just kind of remember, turns this amazing story into a quasi-tragedy as well. So it's an interesting counterpoint. But then I backtracked to St. Louis. And so I went to St. Louis, up to central Montana, canoed, and then went home for the until fall. And then I went back to Montana in the fall and finished out. So I was in the Rockies in roughly the same time. And my last night on the trail, I was camped in a tent on the coast in Oregon, and it was raining. So, but from that point, I was done.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You have this sale now?